FDA recently published a draft guidance to fresh produce growers and others to help inform them of how they are currently interpreting the produce safety rule. This is a draft guidance, and they are looking to industry to provide comments. The key to making informed comments is understanding what's in the draft guidance and how it differs from what has been published before. This video is the 8th in a series to attempt to shed light on these differences and will only cover Chapter 8. Chapter 8 of the draft guidance starts on page 131 and covers Subpart O, Records. Section 1 covers the general requirements for all records. As listed on pages 131 and 132, all required records must include the name and location of your farm, actual values and observations obtained during monitoring, a description of covered produce applicable to the record, the location of the area applicable to the record, and the date and time of the activity. The records also must be created at the time the activity was performed, be accurate, legible, and indelible, and be dated and either signed or initialed by the person who performed the activity. The rest of Section 1 goes into further detail on each of these general requirements. To document your farm location, you should use the postal address or physical location, such as latitude or longitude, of the farm. When it comes to documenting the location of the growing or activity area, you should establish a system to identify areas of your farm, such as with field or building names and numbers. You may also use street addresses or specific coordinates using a GPS. When describing the covered produce in your record, as explained on page 133, you should include the commodity name along with any lot number or code used to identify the produce. For example, if your farm grows different varieties of apples, your record should say Apples Fuji or Apples Granny Smith. It's required that you record actual values and observations obtained during monitoring. In addition, instrument readings must not be rounded or generalized. For example, if you have a pH meter reading of 6.56, this value must be recorded and you must state it as 6.56. You may not round to 7.0 or write pass or unsatisfactory. This is to confirm that required measures have been taken or standards have been met. Your records must be created at the time an activity is performed in order to ensure accuracy. If the record is not created right away, certain details in the record could be inaccurate due to lapses in memory. When recording the date and time of the activity, it's a good idea to establish a procedure to use, such as recording all dates in one specific format. This ensures consistency and clarity. Times should be recorded without rounding or generalization. The requirement that records must be accurate, legible, and indelible is particularly important to keep in mind if you have handwritten records. Here, on page 134, the guidance explains that indelibility of the record is to ensure the original content has not been altered, meaning the record should not be erasable. If mistakes are made, the correction should allow both the original content and the updated content to be read. In order to identify the person who performed the recorded activity, they must date and either sign or initial the record. 3 specific records must be reviewed, dated, and signed by a supervisor or responsible party. Records demonstrating eligibility for a qualified exemption, documentation that process controls were achieved for treated BSAAOs, and documentation of cleaning and sanitizing equipment. Supervisors should make sure that the records are complete, any problems were addressed with corrective measures, and corrective measures were taken in a timely manner. On page 135, it says that the supervisor or responsible party review must take place within a reasonable time after the records were created. FDA believes that an appropriate time period is about 1 week after the record is created. Section 2, on page 136, goes over record storage. You have the flexibility to determine how to store your records, but they must be readily available and accessible to FDA. You may choose to store all required records in one location or in several different locations. You also may choose whether to store your records on the farm or away from the farm. In other words, on-site or off-site. However, it's important to highlight here that off-site storage is only permitted if records can be retrieved and provided on-site within 24 hours of request for official review. Section 3, at the bottom of page 136, covers the use of existing records. Existing records are documents you've already developed and maintained, including records that are kept to comply with other regulations. These records may be used if they contain all of the required information and satisfy the requirements of the Produce Safety Rule. If the existing record contains only some of the required information, you may keep the additional information either separately or in combination with the existing record. You are not required to duplicate the overlapping components. Section 4, on page 137, states that you must keep records required by the Produce Safety Rule for at least 2 years past the date the record was created. In the case of a qualified exemption, gross sales records must be maintained for at least 3 years to support your farm's status during the applicable year. Section 5, on page 137 and 138, clarifies that records may be maintained as original records, true copies, such as photocopies or pictures of the original record, or electronic records. Section 6, on page 138, talks about records disclosure. Records obtained by FDA in accordance with the Produce Safety Rule are subject to disclosure requirements under 21 CFR Part 20, which includes protection for confidential commercial information and trade secrets. The last section in this chapter talks about specific records requirements. Subparts of the Produce Safety Rule that require specific records include Subpart A, General Provisions, Subpart C, Personnel Qualifications and Training, Subpart F, Biological Soil Amendments of Animal Origin and Human Waste, and Subpart L, Equipment, Tools, Buildings, and Sanitation. You can refer to these subparts and relevant chapters on the draft guidance to determine what specific records your farm is required to keep. When making comments on the guidance, keep several things in mind. Reference the section of the rule you have a particular issue with. Be specific about the issue you are presenting. Avoid ranting. Offer alternatives to interpretation. Remember that the law is not changing or going away. This represents how the government interprets the law. The draft guidance covers all aspects of the Produce Safety Rule except Section E, Agricultural Water. Public comment on this draft guidance is being accepted until April 22, 2019. Michigan State University Extension encourages looking into this guidance and commenting before the deadline.